Subscribe to Storylab. Now, let's begin. The gravel crunched under Calvin Rios's boots as he stepped off the Greyhound bus in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. 22 years of service to his country, 18 of them as a Delta Force sniper, and he was finally home for good. The July heat pressed down on his shoulders, but it felt different from the desert heat he'd known for so long. This heat carried the weight of humidity and pine trees instead of sand and blood. His brother Stephen waited by a rusted pickup truck, grinning wide. They embraced hard, the kind of hug that speaks volumes between men who don't say much. "Look at you, old man," Stephen said, though they were only 2 years apart. "Government finally let you retire?" Something like that. Calvin tossed his duffel in the truck bed. His body carried the evidence of his service. A scar along his jaw from Kandahar, another across his ribs from a mission he still couldn't talk about, and a constant ache in his left knee that reminded him of a rooftop in Mosul. At 43, he felt both ancient and newborn. The drive to his rental house took them through the heart of town, past the diner where he'd had his first job, past the high school where he'd been nobody special. Stephen talked about his auto repair shop, about how business was good but not great, about how the town had changed and stayed the same. Calvin listened, watching familiar streets drift by like memories. "Jacqueline still doesn't know you're back?" Stephen asked carefully. "Not yet." Calvin's jaw tightened. His wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife, had stopped returning his calls 6 months ago. The divorce papers had arrived by certified mail while he was finishing his last deployment. She'd cited irreconcilable differences and prolonged absence, which was military wife speak for "I got tired of waiting." What the papers didn't mention was her family. The Dodd Salvatore Dodd ran the Iron Vipers, a motorcycle club that controlled most of the drug trade and illegal gambling in 3 counties. When Calvin had married Jacqueline 8 years ago, he'd been a young sergeant on leave, stupid in love, and willfully blind to the red flags. She'd seemed different from her family, softer, educated, wanting out of that life. Their son Michael had been born 7 months after the wedding. Mikey, 5 years old now, with Calvin's dark eyes and Jacqueline's quick smile. Calvin had missed 3 of those 5 years, deployed to corners of the world he couldn't name, doing work he couldn't describe. The guilt of those absences sat in his chest like shrapnel. "You gonna fight for custody?" Stephen asked. "Already filed with my lawyer. Jacqueline's living with her parents again, at that compound they call a house. No way I'm leaving Mikey there." Stephen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Calvin, you know what Salvatore's like. He's got judges, cops, everyone on his payroll. And those boys of his, Chris, Bobby, and Corey, they're mean as rattlesnakes. You start a custody battle, they'll make it ugly. Let them." Calvin's voice was flat, final. He'd faced down enemies in mountain caves and urban hellholes. Some small-town crime, Lord, didn't scare him. The rental house sat on the edge of town, a small 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a yard that needed work. It wasn't much, but it was his. Calvin spent the afternoon unpacking, arranging his few possessions with military precision. Clothes folded exactly so. Toiletries lined up in the bathroom. His rifle case locked in the bedroom closet. A custom Macmillan TC-50 he'd purchased legally after discharge, though he also had other equipment stored in a climate-controlled unit across town. Habits from 2 decades of service died hard. He just finished when his phone rang. "Jacqueline, I heard you were back," she said without preamble. Her voice had changed, or maybe he'd forgotten its edge. Stephen told someone, "I'm sure. I want to see Mikey." Silence stretched between them. "Calvin, that's complicated. He's my son. You haven't been his father in years. You were always gone, always choosing the military over us." The words were rehearsed, he could tell. Someone had coached her. "I'm here now. The divorce doesn't change that I have rights. My lawyer says." "I don't care what your lawyer says." Calvin kept his voice even. "Tomorrow, I'll come by at noon." "That won't work. My father's having a family thing." "Of course." Salvatore ran his empire from that sprawling property north of town. 10 acres surrounded by high fences, filled with outbuildings and motorcycles and men with hard eyes. Calvin had been there twice before, and both times he'd felt like a tourist in hostile territory. Then bring Mikey to the park. 2 hours. That's all I'm asking. Another pause. Fine. But Calvin, don't make trouble. My family, they don't like trouble. Neither do I. He hung up before she could respond. That night, Calvin couldn't sleep. He lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at ceiling shadows, thinking about his son. 5 years old. Mikey's last birthday had passed while Calvin was in Syria. He'd sent a card and a toy truck, but it wasn't the same. Nothing was ever the same. His phone buzzed with a text from Lewis Curry, his spotter from Delta Force, now running a security consulting firm in Virginia. Heard you're back stateside. Here soon? Soon, Calvin typed back. Lewis was one of the few people who understood what the service took from you, what it made you capable of. They'd saved each other's lives enough times that words became unnecessary. The next morning arrived with summer heat and humidity. Calvin dressed carefully, jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, boots. Nothing threatening. He wanted Jacqueline relaxed, wanted that first meeting with Mikey to be smooth. The park was mostly empty when he arrived, just a few mothers with toddlers and an old man feeding pigeons. Calvin sat on a bench near the playground and waited. His eyes, trained to spot movement at 2,000 meters, tracked every car that passed. Old habits. Jacqueline's black SUV pulled up at 12:07. She got out first, and Calvin's breath caught. She looked different, harder, thinner, with expensive clothes and jewelry that hadn't been there before. The Dodd money had changed her, or maybe it had just revealed who she'd always been. Then Mikey climbed out of the back seat, and nothing else mattered. His son had grown taller, his baby fat melting into the lean build of a child becoming a boy. He wore a small cast on his left arm. "Daddy!" Mikey shouted and ran. Calvin caught him in a hug that felt like coming home and breaking apart simultaneously. The boy smelled like sunshine and swimming pools and innocence. "Hey, buddy. I missed you." Calvin's voice cracked despite himself. "I missed you too. Look, I broke my arm falling off my bike. Uncle Chris says I'm tough." Calvin's eyes met Jacqueline's over Mikey's head. "How did he really break it?" "He told you. Bike accident." But her gaze slid away. They spent the next hour on the playground. Mikey chattered endlessly about kindergarten, about the pool at Grandpa's house, about the motorcycles and the men who came and went. Calvin listened, memorizing every detail, noting every hesitation in his son's voice, every shadow that crossed his small face. When Jacqueline said it was time to go, Mikey clung to Calvin's neck. "Can I stay with you, Daddy? Please." "Soon, buddy. Real soon." Calvin's throat tightened as he watched them drive away. The cast on Mikey's arm. The way Jacqueline had avoided his questions. The fear he'd seen, just for a moment, in his son's eyes. Stephen called that evening. "How'd it go?" "Something's wrong." Calvin stood at his window, watching darkness settle over the town. "I need you to ask around. Quietly. Find out what really happened to Mikey's arm." "Calvin, please." Stephen sighed. "I'll see what I can do. But be careful. The Dodds have eyes everywhere." That night, Calvin dreamed of sand and blood in his son's face. He woke at 0300 hours, drenched in sweat, and couldn't fall back asleep. Instead, he cleaned his rifle and made plans. The call came 3 days later. Calvin was at Stephen's shop, helping with an oil change, when his phone exploded with his brother's ringtone at maximum volume. He almost didn't answer. Stephen was right there. Then realized it was Stephen's phone calling him. "Calvin." Stephen's voice was pure panic, shaking, barely controlled. "You need to get to county hospital. Now." "It's Mikey." The world narrowed to a pinpoint. "What happened?" "Just God, Calvin, I'm there now. Your in-laws called me. They said," Stephen's voice broke. "Just get here. Fast." Calvin drove with the cold precision of a man who'd operated under fire. Every traffic law a suggestion he ignored. His mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. Broken bones, concussion, car accident. The cast on Mikey's arm had been a warning he'd been too slow to heed. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty. Calvin found Stephen outside the ER, pacing, his face sheet white. "Where is he?" Calvin grabbed his brother's shoulders. They took him to ICU. Stephen's eyes were wet. "Calvin, I'm so sorry. I should have. I heard rumors, but I didn't think. Tell me what happened." Stephen's words came out in a rush. Jacqueline called me because she couldn't reach you. She was hysterical. Said Mikey was at her parents' house. He was playing inside, knocked over some expensive vase in Salvatore's office. The old man went crazy, started yelling. Then Chris and Bobby grabbed Mikey, dragged him outside to the pool. Calvin's blood turned to ice water. Stephen. They held him under. Stephen was crying now, not caring who saw, as punishment for breaking the vase. Jacqueline said she tried to stop them, but Corey held her back. By the time they pulled Mikey out, he wasn't breathing. They did CPR, called 911, but Calvin was moving before Stephen finished, pushing through the ER doors, his vision tunneling. A nurse tried to stop him. He moved past her like she wasn't there. Found the ICU. Found Jacqueline outside a room, flanked by her mother Shirley and two men he recognized as Iron Vipers members. Jacqueline looked destroyed, makeup running, hands shaking. Calvin, he didn't stop. Through the ICU room door. And there was Mikey. Small. Too small. In a bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hissed and measured a life that hung by threads. His son's face was gray, lips blue, chest rising and falling only because a ventilator forced air into his lungs. Calvin had seen death in 100 forms, had dealt it out with surgical precision, but nothing had prepared him for this. A doctor appeared at his elbow. Mr. Rios? I'm Dr. Patterson. Your son suffered a severe hypoxic brain injury due to drowning. We're doing everything we can, but the next 24 hours are critical. His chances... The doctor's pause said everything. We're hopeful, but you should prepare yourself. The damage was extensive. Calvin stood by his son's bed, holding a tiny hand that didn't squeeze back, and felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. This child, his child, had been hurt by people who were supposed to protect him. People who Jacqueline had chosen over leaving. He stayed there for hours, unmoving, while Jacqueline hovered in the doorway and the machines kept rhythm with a heartbeat that wasn't strong enough. Stephen brought coffee he didn't drink. Nurses checked vitals and gave him sympathetic looks he didn't acknowledge. At 2,100 hours, Calvin stepped into the hallway. Jacqueline sat in a waiting room chair, her mother beside her. The two Iron Vipers members were gone. Where's your father? Calvin's voice was perfectly calm. Jacqueline looked up with red-rimmed eyes. He's not here. Calvin, he feels terrible. They all do. It was an accident. Chris just meant to scare Mikey a little, teach him respect. They didn't mean for it to go so far. Where's Salvatore? At home. Calvin, please. And your brothers? They're upset too. This is killing them. Calvin walked away. He'd heard enough. Out to his truck. Drove through dark streets with that same cold precision. The Dodd compound sat behind its high fence, blazing with lights and motorcycles parked in rows. Calvin pulled up to the gate. Two guards approached, both wearing Iron Vipers cuts, the leather vests that marked gang membership. Help you? One asked, hand near his waistband. I'm here to see Salvatore. I'm his son-in-law. The guards exchanged looks. One spoke into a radio. After a moment, the gate opened. Calvin drove through, parking near the main house, a sprawling ranch-style structure that screamed new money and old crimes. Salvatore Dodd waited on the porch, flanked by his three sons. The man was in his 60s, barrel-chested, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and arms sleeved in tattoos. Chris, Bobby, and Corey stood behind him, all in their 30s, all wearing the same hard expressions as their father. Calvin got out slowly, hands visible, everything about his posture non-threatening. Inside, he was doing calculations. Distances, cover points, exits. The part of him that had survived 22 years of warfare never slept. Calvin. Salvatore's voice was gravelly from decades of cigarettes. Terrible thing. Just terrible. How's the boy? Fighting for his life. Calvin stopped 10 feet away. The doctors aren't optimistic. That's a shame. Real shame. Salvatore shook his head. Kids, you know, they don't understand about respecting people's property. That vase was worth 15 grand. Now, I'm not saying what happened was right, but what? But accidents happen. Boys roughhousing. Sometimes things go too far. Salvatore shrugged, and that gesture, That casual dismissal of his grandson's suffering made Calvin's hands curl into fists. Mikey is 5 years old enough to learn respect. Your sons held him underwater until he stopped breathing. Chris stepped forward, all swagger and poorly hidden guilt. He was fine when we pulled him out. Started breathing on his own after a minute. All that hospital drama is your ex being hysterical. Calvin looked at Chris. Really looked. Memorized his face, his build, the cocky tilt of his head. Then Bobby. Then Corey. His mind automatically calculated kill shots. Center mass. Between the eyes. The soft spot below the ribcage angled toward the heart. You're right, Calvin said quietly. Accidents happen. Salvatore seemed surprised by the agreement. He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. That's smart. That's real smart. See, I was worried you'd come here causing trouble. But you're a military man. You understand chains of command, understanding your place. My daughter chose to marry you, and that's fine. But you got no power here. You're nobody. And that kid, Salvatore, jerked his thumb toward town, toward the hospital. He was just a mistake anyway. The words hung in the night air. What are you going to do, soldier boy? Salvatore's smile widened. You going to fight me? Fight my boys? Fight my whole club? You're one man. I got 86 brothers who'd ride to hell for me. Calvin didn't speak. He just looked at each man in turn. Salvatore, Chris, Bobby, Corey, committing them to memory the way he'd once memorized targets through a scope. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. That's right. Chris called after him. Tuck your tail and run. You're nothing. You ain't gonna do. Calvin drove away. He didn't speed. Didn't show emotion. At a red light 2 blocks from the compound, he called Stephen. How is he? Stephen asked immediately. No change. Calvin's voice was empty. I need you to do something. Don't ask questions. Tomorrow morning, I need you to take Mom and go visit Aunt Linda in Philadelphia. Stay there for a week. Don't come back until I call. Calvin, what are you planning? Stephen. The tone was one his brother had never heard. The voice of a man who'd operated in shadows, who'd been the last thing enemies saw. Do what I'm asking. Please. Trust me. Silence. Then, okay, we'll leave at dawn. Calvin hung up and drove to his rental. Inside, he stood in the dark for a long time, thinking about his son's gray face, about the machines breathing for him, about 5 years old and a broken vase and men who laughed about drowning children. Then he went to his bedroom closet and began pulling out equipment he'd never thought he'd use on American soil. Mikey died at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The doctor said it was peaceful, that he simply slipped away. Calvin had been holding his son's hand when the machines flatlined, when the nurses came running, when Jacqueline collapsed screaming. He didn't remember much of the next hour. Forms to sign. Jacqueline's family arriving in mass. Salvatore, his sons, what seemed like dozens of Iron Vipers members, all offering hollow condolences. Shirley crying. Jacqueline catatonic with grief. Calvin stood apart from them all, numb, as a chaplain offered prayers and a social worker brought tissues, and the hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency to transform a room where a child had died into just another empty space. The funeral, Salvatore said at some point, his hand heavy on Calvin's shoulder. We'll handle everything. The Dodds take care of their own. Calvin nodded and said nothing. He drove home on autopilot, his mind a carefully maintained blank. At his house, he sat in his truck for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. Then his phone rang. Lewis Curry. Brother, I heard. Lewis's voice was tight with anger and grief. I'm so sorry. What do you need? Nothing. Bullshit. Talk to me. Calvin closed his eyes. My son is dead because some criminals thought drowning him was an appropriate punishment for breaking a vase. The local cops won't touch it. The family owns them. The father-in-law laughed in my face. Lewis was quiet for a long moment. You want help? No, because this was something Calvin had to do alone. This was personal in a way that transcended friendship. Calvin, I'll call you when it's done. He hung up. For the rest of that day, Calvin didn't leave his house. He sat at his kitchen table and thought. Planned. War game scenarios with the cold logic of a man who'd spent 2 decades planning operations. The Dodds were criminals, but they weren't stupid. They had resources, numbers, connections. But Calvin had something they didn't. He'd been forged in the world's worst places. He'd hunted men through mountains and cities. He'd made impossible shots in impossible conditions. And now, for the first time in his career, he had nothing to lose. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday. Closed casket. Calvin had refused to look at his son's body after the hospital. He wanted to remember Mikey alive, laughing, full of light. The service was at Sacred Heart Church, and the turnout was massive. The Dodds brought their whole club. People who'd never known Mikey came because Salvatore expected it. Calvin sat in the front pew, wearing his dress uniform, and felt every eye on him. Jacqueline sat on the other side of the aisle with her family. She'd stopped trying to talk to him after he didn't respond to her fourth phone call. The priest spoke about innocence and God's plan and finding peace. Calvin stared at the small white casket and made his own plans. After the cemetery, there was a reception at the Dodd compound. Calvin didn't want to go, but Stephen convinced him. "You need to be seen," his brother said. "You need them to think you're broken, grieving, harmless." So Calvin went. Stood in the corner with a beer he didn't drink. Watched the Iron Vipers get drunk and loud. Watched Salvatore hold court like a king. Watched Chris, Bobby, and Corey laugh with their friends. Any guilt they'd felt already buried under alcohol and bravado. Around 9 p.m., Calvin left without saying goodbye to anyone. Drove home, changed into dark clothes, and went to work. His first stop was a storage unit on the industrial side of town. Inside, he kept things the Army didn't need to know about. Equipment acquired over 2 decades of deployments. Gear that had a way of disappearing during missions. Night vision. Suppressed Glock 19. Combat knife. Plastic explosives. Detonators. Chemical compounds. Calvin loaded everything into his truck and drove to a state park 20 miles outside town. Found a secluded spot. Set up his equipment in the dark, his hands remembering skills he'd honed over countless missions. Chris Dodd was the first. He lived in a trailer on the back section of the Dodd property, away from the main house. He liked his privacy for the parties he threw, for the drugs he used, for the girls he brought home. Security was light back there, just cameras that Calvin disabled with a signal jammer. Calvin waited in the trees, watching through night vision. At 2 a.m., Chris stumbled out of his trailer to urinate off the side of the porch. He was alone, drunk, vulnerable. Calvin moved like a shadow. No sound, no warning. The suppressed pistol coughed once. Chris dropped where he stood, a neat hole in his temple. Calvin dragged the body to his truck, drove it across the property to the pool, that godforsaken pool where Mikey had died. He weighed Chris's body down with weights from his trailer's home gym, then let it sink into the deep end. The water barely rippled. Calvin stood there for a moment, looking at the dark surface, remembering his son's face. One down. Bobby Dodd lived on the opposite side of the compound, in a converted garage apartment above the club's maintenance bay. He was the careful one, the one who stayed sober, the one Salvatore trusted with counting money and managing product. His security was better. Motion sensors, better cameras, a pit bull that barked at strangers. Calvin came through the ventilation system. An old tactic from urban warfare, uncomfortable but effective. The ductwork led him above Bobby's apartment. Through the grating, he could see Bobby at his desk, hunched over ledgers, utterly focused. Calvin dropped 2 small gas canisters through the grate. They hissed, releasing colorless, odorless fumes. Nitrogen asphyxiation. Bobby didn't even have time to stand before he slumped over his desk, unconscious, dead within 3 minutes. Calvin dropped down, recovered his canisters, and checked the pulse. Nothing. He staged it to look like Bobby had fallen asleep at his desk, then carried him through the dark compound to the pool. Another set of weights. Another body joining his brother at the bottom. 2 down. Corey was the problem child. He didn't live on the compound. He kept an apartment in town, near the bars, near the action. He was the youngest, the wildest, the one who'd been laughing loudest at the reception. Calvin found him at Lucky's bar at 1:30 a.m., hitting on a college girl who clearly wanted him to leave her alone. Calvin waited outside, patient. At closing time, Corey stumbled out alone, pissed off and drunk. He headed toward his motorcycle in the parking lot. Calvin stepped from between cars. Corey Dodd. Corey squinted. Who wants to know? You held my wife while your brothers drowned my son. Recognition and fear flashed across Corey's face simultaneously. He reached for something in his jacket, a gun probably, but Calvin was faster. 2 quick strikes, both nerve clusters. Corey dropped, gasping, paralyzed. Calvin dragged him to his truck, drove him back to the compound. Security was heavier now. It was closer to dawn, and some of the club members were stirring. Calvin had to be careful. Used his remaining jammer to kill cameras in a blind spot near the back fence. Carried Corey over, through the trees, to the pool. Please, Corey gasped, feeling returning to his limbs. Please, man, I'm sorry. We didn't mean. My son was 5 years old. Calvin's voice was empty. He's gone. Now you're gone. He held Corey under the water the same way they'd held Mikey. Watch him thrash and fight and drown. Felt nothing but cold satisfaction. When Corey stopped moving, Calvin weighed him down and let him sink with his brothers. 3 down. Calvin left the compound as dawn broke, unseen, and drove home. Showered. Changed. Made coffee. By the time Stephen called at 8 a.m. to check on him, Calvin sounded perfectly normal. I'm okay, he said. Just trying to process everything. You want company? Not yet. Maybe tomorrow. He sat at his kitchen table and waited. It took until noon for the bodies to be discovered. The news erupted across town like a bomb. Calvin watched it on local TV, saw the police cars and ambulances rushing to the Dodd compound, saw the aerial footage of the pool being drained, saw Salvatore's grief-stricken face as he identified his sons. The police called it suspicious, but stopped short of declaring it murder. All 3 men found in the same pool where Salvatore's grandson had drowned days earlier. The media speculated about guilt, about remorse, about a triple suicide pact. Calvin knew better. And by evening, so did Salvatore. The call came at 9 p.m. from a block number. You're a dead man. Salvatore's voice rasped. You hear me? You're fucking dead. My boys, you think you can just... They drowned my son, Calvin said calmly. Now they know what that feels like. I'm gonna kill you. Slowly. I'm gonna make you beg. You know where I live. Salvatore hung up. Calvin sat back and waited for the response he knew was coming. He'd taken everything from a man who'd built his identity on being untouchable. There was only one way this could end now. The Iron Vipers would come for him. All of them. The first motorcycles arrived at 11:47 p.m. Calvin was ready. He'd spent the day preparing, turning his rental house and yard into a kill zone. Tripwires, claymores, pressure plates. Every lesson from 22 years of combat applied to one small piece of American suburbia. He watched from his darkened living room as the bikes poured down his street. Dozens of them, headlights blazing, engines roaring. The neighbors' lights snapped on. Doors opened. People stared. Someone would call the police, but it wouldn't matter. By the time cops arrived, this would be over. The Iron Vipers spread out around his property, a ring of leather and chrome and hatred. Calvin counted them through his night vision scope. 73. No, 76. Salvatore had brought his entire club, every patch member, every prospect, everyone who'd sworn loyalty. They killed their engines in near unison, and the sudden silence was deafening. Then Salvatore's voice, amplified through a megaphone. Calvin Rios, come out here and face what's coming. You killed my sons, you coward. You murdered them. Now you're gonna pay. Calvin didn't respond. He moved through his house with practiced silence, checking positions, confirming fields of fire. His rifle rested on a bipod in his bedroom, angled to cover the front approach. His sidearm was on his hip. Extra magazines everywhere. I know you're in there. Salvatore continued. You think you're some kind of soldier? Some kind of hero? You're nothing. You're gonna die tonight. But first, you're gonna suffer. We're gonna burn you out, beat you down, and then... The first Iron Viper to approach the front porch triggered a tripwire. The small explosive charge wasn't lethal, just a flashbang, but it sent the man stumbling backward with a scream, temporarily blind and deaf. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be easy. He's rigged the place, someone shouted. Salvatore's voice turned venomous. So what? Burn it. Burn it all. 3 bikers ran toward the house with Molotov cocktails. Calvin dropped the first two with precise shots from his bedroom window. Not kill shots, but center mass hits that put them down hard. The third threw his bottle, which shattered against the side of the house, flames licking up the siding. Spread out. Tommy Ashley, one of Salvatore's lieutenants, was trying to organize them. Multiple entry points. Overwhelm him. They tried. 10 bikers rushed the back door simultaneously while others covered with pistol fire. They made it 3 steps into the yard before hitting the pressure plate Calvin had wired to a Claymore-style device. The explosion sent them flying, screams cutting through the night. The Iron Vipers fell back, regrouping. Calvin used the lull to shift positions, moving to his kitchen with his rifle. Outside, he could hear arguing, shouting, confusion. They'd expected an easy kill. One man, outnumbered, would either surrender or die quickly. They hadn't expected combat. "This is crazy," one biker yelled. "He's gonna kill us all. So we kill him first." Salvatore roared. "Arthur, Herman, Blake, take the garage. Break in through there. Go, go." The 3 men moved with more caution now, using parked motorcycles for cover, advancing slowly. They reached the garage without incident, then used a crowbar to pry open the side door. The garage was empty except for Calvin's truck and a sealed metal drum in the corner. Arthur approached it carefully. "The hell is this?" He touched the drum. It beeped. "Run!" Herman screamed. The explosion was shaped. Most of the force went upward, blowing out the garage roof. Arthur died instantly. Herman and Blake were thrown backward, alive but badly burned. The fire spread quickly, consuming what was left of the garage structure. "Jesus Christ," a biker near Salvatore said. "Boss, this guy's a professional. We need to finish this." Salvatore's face was twisted with rage and grief. "He killed my boys. All of them. I don't care if we lose half the club. That man dies tonight." But the Iron Vipers weren't soldiers. They were criminals, used to intimidation and overwhelming force against weaker opponents. Facing an entrenched enemy who fought back was different. Some were already backing toward their bikes, fear overtaking anger. "Anyone who runs is out of the club." Salvatore shouted. "You hear me? You're dead to me. We move together, or we're nothing." Tyrone Post, a wiry man in his 40s who'd been with the club 20 years, stepped forward. "Salvatore, man, be reasonable. We hit him with all we got. He's ready for us. Maybe we fall back, hit him when he's in the open." Salvatore shot him, just drew his pistol and put a round in Tyrone's chest. The man fell, gasping, while everyone stared in shock. "Anyone else want to suggest we run?" Salvatore's voice was eerily calm. "No. Good. Now somebody give me a goddamn RPG." "We don't have," someone started. "Then improvise. We got trucks, we got chains. We tear this house down around him." They brought up a pickup truck, attached a chain to Calvin's porch supports, and tried to rip the structure apart. Calvin shot out 2 tires before they completed the first pull, then dropped the driver with a shot through the windshield. Not lethal, just disabling. But they were adapting. A group on the north side found the one approach Calvin hadn't fully trapped, a neighbor's yard with a fence they could scale. 6 bikers came over together, suppressing fire, keeping Calvin pinned while they advanced. Calvin moved to intercept, but they were fast, determined. One made it to a window, smashed it, started climbing through. Calvin met him with his combat knife, a quick, brutal fight in the dark hallway. The biker was strong, experienced in bar fights and back alley brawls, but Calvin had killed men professionally. The fight lasted 10 seconds. The biker dropped, bleeding out from a severed femoral artery, but 2 more were coming through. Calvin fired point blank, retreating through his house, drawing them deeper. They followed, screaming curses, firing wildly. One round grazed Calvin's shoulder, first blood. He felt the burn, ignored it, and led them to his bedroom, where he'd set up his final trap. The bikers burst through the doorway. Calvin dove aside as they triggered the wire that released a cascade of homemade smoke grenades and flashbangs. The room became chaos, blinding light, choking smoke, disorientation. Calvin put them both down with aimed shots through the haze, then moved back toward the front of the house. His shoulder was bleeding steadily now, his shirt sticky. Outside, the Iron Vipers were regrouping again. He'd taken out maybe 15 of them, but that left 60 still ready to fight. And Salvatore was herding them forward through sheer force of personality and threats. Calvin's phone buzzed. He ignored it. Buzzed again. Glanced at the screen. Lewis Curry. "Kinda busy," Calvin answered. "I'm 10 minutes out with a team," Lewis said. "Track your phone." Saw the news. "Hold on. Negative. This is my fight." "Bullshit. You're outnumbered 60-1. We're coming." Calvin wanted to argue, but his shoulder was screaming and the house was on fire in 3 places and the Iron Vipers were trying to flank his position. "East side is the weak point," he said. "Watch for traps." "Copy." 9 minutes. Calvin dropped the phone and moved to his second firing position, the upstairs bathroom, which gave him a clear view of the street. The Iron Vipers were massing for a final assault. Salvatore stood in the center, directing traffic, his face illuminated by burning vehicles and house fires. All at once, Salvatore screamed, "Every entrance! Drown him in numbers! Move!" They came like a wave. Front door, back door, windows, garage, every possible entry point. Calvin fired methodically. 1 shot, 1 target down or disabled. But there were too many. They were inside, rushing through smoke and fire, hunting him. Calvin retreated to the bathroom, slammed the door, braced it with furniture. Fists pounded on the wood. Bullets punched through, splinters flying. The door was buckling. Then, over the chaos, a new sound, sirens. But not police sirens. Something else. The bathroom door exploded inward. 2 bikers rushed in. Calvin dropped the first with a shot to the kneecap, grappled with the second, both of them crashing into the bathtub. The biker was younger, stronger, managed to pin Calvin's gun arm. His other hand found Calvin's throat. Calvin's vision started to gray at the edges. Below, he heard new shouting, different screaming. Gunfire that wasn't his. Then footsteps thundering up the stairs. The bathroom mirror shattered as Lewis Curry appeared, firing twice. The biker on top of Calvin jerked and fell away. Lewis grabbed Calvin, hauled him up. "Time to go, brother." They moved fast, Lewis leading his team, 4 other former Delta operators, clearing the house with professional efficiency. Outside, complete chaos. The Iron Vipers had found themselves facing a different enemy now. Trained special operations soldiers who'd fought in the world's worst hellholes. It wasn't even close to a fair fight. Lewis's team had brought real weapons. M4 carbines, flashbangs, smoke grenades, and they used them with devastating effect. The bikers broke, finally, survival instinct overcoming loyalty. Motorcycles roared to life. Men fled in every direction. But Salvatore didn't run. He stood in the middle of the street, emptying his pistol at anything that moved, screaming about his sons, about Calvin, about revenge. When his gun clicked empty, he just reloaded and kept firing. Calvin pulled away from Lewis, moved through the smoke and chaos toward his father-in-law. Salvatore saw him coming, raised his pistol. Calvin was faster. 2 shots, both legs. Salvatore went down hard, screaming. Calvin stood over him. "My son was 5 years old." "Fuck you." Salvatore spat blood. "You think this is over? You think it's over." Calvin's voice was flat. "Your sons are dead. Your club is broken. And you're going to prison for ordering an attack on my home. The police are 2 minutes out. So are the federal agents." "What? Did you really think I did all this without insurance?" Calvin smiled without humor. "Every word you said tonight was recorded. Every crime confessed. The DEA has been looking for a way to take down the Iron Vipers for years. I gave them everything they needed. Your empire is done." Salvatore's face contorted with understanding and rage. "You set me up. All of this was justice for Mikey." Calvin turned and walked away as police sirens filled the night. The aftermath took weeks to sort out. Calvin spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The gunshot wound, smoke inhalation, various cuts and bruises. Federal agents visited daily, taking statements, building their case. The story was straightforward. Calvin Rios, grieving father, had defended his home against an illegal attack by a criminal organization. Self-defense, clear and unambiguous, especially with the recordings and witness testimony from neighbors. The fact that he'd been wearing a wire, courtesy of Lewis, who connected him with a sympathetic DEA agent, meant every word Salvatore screamed was evidence. The Iron Vipers were dismantled. Salvatore went to federal prison on multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, assault with deadly weapons, and a laundry list of drug and racketeering offenses. 43 other club members were arrested. The remaining members scattered, the club's reputation destroyed. Jacqueline tried to visit Calvin once. He refused to see her. Their divorce was finalized without contest. She got nothing, and he didn't care. She moved away, and Calvin never asked where. Mikey was buried in a quiet cemetery outside town. Calvin visited twice a week, sitting by the small headstone, talking to his son about nothing and everything. The guilt of not being there, of not protecting him, would never fully heal. But he'd done the one thing he could, made sure those responsible paid the price. 3 months after the siege, Calvin stood in his new house, purchased with the money from selling the destroyed rental. Stephen helped him move furniture, making jokes, trying to keep things light. "You gonna stay in Millbrook?" Stephen asked. For now, Calvin looked out the window at the peaceful street. "Mikey's here. I'm not leaving him." Lewis visited a week later, bringing beer and his particular brand of aggressive support. They sat on Calvin's porch as the sun set, not saying much, not needing to. "You did what you had to do," Lewis finally said. "Did I?" Calvin took a long pull from his beer. "Or did I just prove I'm as much a killer as them?" "Not even close." Lewis's voice was firm. "Your father who got justice when the system failed. There's a difference." Maybe. Calvin wanted to believe that. He thought about Mikey's laugh, about his small hand in Calvin's, about 5 years of life cut short by cruelty and arrogance. He thought about Chris, Bobby, and Corey at the bottom of that pool, about Salvatore rotting in a cell, about an empire of criminals brought down by one determined man. "I'd do it again," Calvin said quietly. "If I had to, I'd do it all again." "I know." Lewis clinked his beer against Calvin's. "That's what makes you dangerous." They drank in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, 2 warriors at rest, carrying the weight of their choices, living with what they'd done and what they'd survived. In the end, Calvin Rios stayed in Millbrook. He visited his son's grave. He helped Stephen at the shop. He kept in touch with Lewis and the team that had saved his life. He lived quietly, a ghost haunting familiar streets, a man who'd seen too much darkness but refused to let it consume him entirely. The nightmares never stopped. Mikey's gray face, the sound of machines flatlining, Salvatore's laughter. But they were balanced by other memories. His son's smile, his laugh, the feeling of small arms around his neck saying, "I love you, Daddy." Justice, Calvin had learned, was a messy thing. It didn't heal all wounds or bring back the dead. But it meant something. It had to mean something. Because if it didn't, if those 5 years of Mikey's life meant nothing, if the men who'd killed him faced no consequences, then what was the point of any of it? Calvin stood on his porch one evening, 6 months after the siege, watching the town where he'd been born and where his son had died. The scars on his shoulder ached in the cold. His knee throbbed with old injury and new trauma. He was 43 going on 100, carrying ghosts and regrets. But he was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to let the darkness win completely. And that, he decided, would have to be enough.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.